Tom, it's a big week in the country. Donald Trump is being...
I thought you were going to say there was a big football game this week.
Well, there was. I don't know how many people watched it. I did see a lot of boos when our current president was making his speech at the beginning. I thought that was interesting for a guy who received the most presidential votes in the history of our country.
You know, I know this isn't the topic, and we're going to move on, but I got to say, I watched the Super Bowl, and my wife and I were doing some things in the house. We had the TV on even before the game started, and it felt less like a sporting event and more like a religious experience, an attempt to proselytize people in the church of progressive identity politics. There was less talk about sports and athleticism and all the things that go with that, and lots of talk about this person, the gender of this person, and the skin color of that person. It was just identity politics on parade.
Well, you commented to me, it was a few months back, you were visiting your kids and talking about, you guys sat and watched a Kansas City Chiefs game several months ago. And during that game, you commented to me at that time about how much just overwhelmingly this message of progressivism was all over the game. And it was more about that than the game itself. And I've said this before. I mean, we've been Broncos season ticket holders in my family long before I was born.
Yeah.
My grandfather had tickets. My dad's had season tickets. I've been going to as many games more games than I could possibly count. And at the same time, this year I was kind of glad that COVID shut it down because I didn't want to go.
Yeah.
I mean, it might have been the only good thing that came out of this whole COVID shutdown thing was it kept me from having to decide what to do with these Bronco tickets that I quite frankly just didn't want to use.
And you know, the truth is I don't want to present myself as some completely disinterested, observer who has no skin in this. No, I'm a citizen. I have lots of skin in this. And so my beef is not merely that how sports has been so politicized. It's the kind of politics. It's nefarious, destructive, progressive central planning politics. If they're going to politicize sports, I wish there'd be some mention of property rights and the importance of that, right? Or the idea of equal protection of the laws, or, bring the politics of freedom into sports if you're going to politicize it.
Right.
But it's never the politics of freedom. It's everything cuts in the direction of the progressive politics of central planning. And that's sort of how we got to this big political week, which you were just starting to introduce before I diverted us.
Well, no, I mean, it's all kind of one and the same, right? Because that was political. And really the theatrics of what we're going to see the rest of this week, or what we've seen all week, is political theatrics in and of itself. Donald Trump is now facing his second charge of impeachment in the Senate. He has been impeached by the House, and now it's up to the Senate on whether or not they want to convict him of intent to incite or incitement of insurrection. Is that right? What the actual word, incitement of insurrection.
Yeah.
And I thought today, I honestly I don't think it's even a necessary conversation for us to go into what we think about the charges against Donald Trump and everything else. Like I said, it's political theater. It is what has become more commonplace than anything in this country is the use of impeachment as a political tool over the last 50, 70 years. That said, I think the ideas of insurrection and sedition, which are the two key sort of ideas. These are old ideas. These are ideas that go back to British North America.
Well, before we head back in time, let me. I just wanted to offer a constitutional basis here for the very political nature of impeachment and what people are going to see. I'm reading from the United States Constitution in our handy introduction to citizenship here. This is in Article 1, which creates the Congress, the legislative branch. Section 3, it makes it Section 2, it makes it very clear that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. So if the House of Representatives decides to pass articles of impeachment, they have the sole power. This gives no other part of government, doesn't give to the Supreme Court or to any other organization or body of people any kind of oversight or veto power. That's it. If they want to impeach, they are free to impeach. And then the very next section, Article 1, Section 3, says the Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. So whether or not, this is one of the things that it almost makes it a little difficult to talk about the merits, because the reality is if 2/3 of the Senate wants to convict Donald Trump, even though he's no longer president, can't be removed from office, they are free to cast that vote. Nobody can stop them from voting for conviction. No court has any jurisdiction to overturn that. So really what we'll do is we'll kind of watch, right? We're gonna watch as this thing unfolds. And if some important constitutional ideas or principles come out of those conversations, we'll talk about that as this whole thing unfolds. But you're right, all this certainly points to a much bigger, much deeper. This goes way, way, way beyond Donald Trump and some partisan, there's some Democrats and a few never-Trumper Republicans in Congress. And I think most people are focused on that. But this idea of inciting, they didn't charge him with insurrection. They didn't say like he picked up a gun and charged at the Capitol, right, and physically that is insurrection.
Right.
They're not saying he did that. They're saying he incited it. That's using speech or other forms of communication to encourage, incite other people to go engage in, violent attacks on the government.
Which is in reality closer to the definition of sedition than it is insurrection. I think we all kind of know that the whole idea here is they wanted to tie him to insurrection rather than sedition because the potential penalties of insurrection that the Senate can impose versus a court of law can be much, much harsher, including preventing him from running for any public office in the future.
Let's just do a quick overview here just to make sure our listeners, we're all on the same page. Impeachment, the whole impeachment process. This is a process described by the Constitution. This is not a matter of federal law. This is in the Constitution. And it is a political process. In fact, the authors of the Federalist Papers describe it as a political process. And the penalty, if you are, the House has the power to impeach. Remember, the word impeach just means to raise a question. Right? Think of, we often will use the phrase, we'll say, talk about a person we admire, they have an unimpeachable character, they're beyond question, right? When you impeach someone, you are questioning whether they did something wrong. And that is in the House of Representatives. And then the Senate
and before you go into the Senate, the House of Representatives, there's a reason that it's only a majority, right? Impeachment is a majority. It's a simple question of, do the majority of the members of the House of Representatives want to raise the question and bring this to trial in the Senate?
That is correct.
Right? It is not there's a reason they just did simple majority and not a 2/3 vote or supermajority.
Because then impeachment is an accusation.
Right.
And then the really important part is determining, is that accusation true? Did this person do this thing they've been accused of doing? That then is in the Senate. That trial is in the Senate. And it's a very peculiar structure explained in the Constitution that it requires 2/3 of sitting members of senators, the members present. That's a big hurdle to get to. Think of how divided and partisan and cantankerous Congress is today. To get 2/3 of senators to agree on anything is really difficult. But that's what's needed to convict a person who has been impeached. And if they're convicted, only a few things happen. They're removed from office. That's the number one thing. The person convicted shall be removed from office. That's what Article 1 of the United States Constitution says. And they can be disqualified from holding any office of trust or honor in the United States again. They don't go to jail.
Right.
They're not fined. They don't have any property seized, right? Because this is not a criminal trial. This is a political process. It's basically, impeachment is a way for those in government to remove what they see as a really bad apple, someone who has betrayed the public trust and needs to be removed right now. We can't wait for the next election cycle. We need to remove this person. And that's all that it is.
What's interesting about that is, and I still will never understand this, they are removing somebody because they think they're a bad apple. but they leave a door, they leave a clause, they leave an opportunity to say, we're going to impeach, but we're not going to apply this. He or she can never run for office again, right? It says may not, but there is a door, there is a pathway, and that can change as the Congress and as the Congress changes, right? As the House of Representatives changes, the Senate changes, they can vote to actually change the ruling and say, well, this Senate said this person may not hold office in the future, but we're changing our mind. We don't think that the crime was that bad. We don't think the conviction was worthy. We're going to reopen that opportunity, and we've seen that happen a few times.
Yeah, let me offer a little constitutional basis for what you're talking about here. So I am reading from Article 1 of the Constitution, which again creates the legislative branch, Congress. This is in Section 3 of Article 1, which explains the Senate. It creates the Senate and lays out the basic qualifications and how the Senate's going to work. And we find this sentence: judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office. And then there's a comma. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting. Legal theorists and members of Congress for many decades have placed tremendous emphasis on that comma, because what they say about that comma is judgment, if you are impeached and convicted, you will be removed from office, comma, and then everything after that, which says, and disqualification to hold any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States, that disqualification part is optional. That's kind of up to the Senate to decide whether they are disqualifying the person who was impeached and convicted from holding office in the future. Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right. If that is up to members of the Senate right now, then members of a future Senate could reverse that. Right? They could say, hey, that old Senate, members of a prior Senate session said this person that was impeached and convicted was disqualified. We change our minds. We now think that they are, and so that is how, in fact, we have the very strange anomaly. We have a sitting member of Congress right now.
Right.
I just mentioned you and
Hastings.
Alcee Hastings, he's from Florida, and he's in the House of Representatives. He's been there almost my entire adult life. Yep. I graduated high school in 1987, and just a few years later, he gets elected to the House of Representatives, and he's been there ever since. This guy, and I encourage people to go look him up. He's a strange name, Alcee, Alcee Hastings. He was a federal judge.
Right.
He was a big deal. He was nominated by Jimmy Carter.
1977.
Yeah. So this guy's been in the federal government, right, his entire life. And as a judge, he was impeached by the House of Representatives and then convicted by 2/3 of the Senate. And here he is. He's in government today. That happened back in the early 90s, I believe. Yeah, I think it was the early 90s when he was impeached.
89.
89, okay.
89.
He was impeached and convicted, and then in 1992 he ran for the House of Representatives and he won. What? And he's been in Congress since.
He immediately following his conviction in 89, in 90 he ran for Secretary of State of Florida, and he lost. But he lost by a slim margin.
Yeah.
And he realized he was a politician. He was good at being a politician.
Yeah.
So he said, okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. And 2 years later, in 92, he runs for office. And here's what's really interesting. So that Senate that convicted him, mm-hmm. That impeached him or convicted him of the impeachment question,
right,
decided that they were not going to prevent him from running again in the future, from holding political office again. As we've said now, they have that option, or they've interpreted that they have that option. And what's really amazing is when somebody does that, it tends to be a pattern. So he gets impeached for taking bribes as a judge, right?
Right.
This is a guy who's just been doing this over and over again. If I remember, there were 3 people who voted against conviction in the entire Senate.
Everybody else voted for.
Everybody else voted for impeachment, and there were like 8 counts.
So just to give our listeners here a sense of how corrupt this guy is. I mean, we all know, how loyal crony Democrats tend to be to each other. They cover each other's backs politically,
right,
almost all the time. It's a rare thing for Democrats to come out, right, in opposition to fellow Democrats. And a bunch of Democrats, partisan Democrats in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, came out against this guy, a fellow Democrat.
In '89, it was a Democrat-controlled House and a Democrat-controlled Senate that impeached him.
Yeah.
This wasn't even a Republican hunt against this
right.
guy. This was his own party saying, you can't be a judge anymore in Florida.
Yep.
Since that time, right, we talk about things generally tend to be a trend. When you do something a few times in one public office, you start to think, oh, I can do this anytime.
Yeah.
The guy has been accused of using taxpayer money to get himself a Lexus. He has been charged with sexual harassment of a staffer.
Well, come on, Dave. At least you've got a nice car.
He got a nice car. That's what he needed to hit on the staffer, apparently.
Yeah.
But it's just been one thing after another. He was the one leading the charge to throw out the 2000 election of George W. Bush, saying that his own state, Florida's elections, should not be counted. This is the guy who ran for Secretary of State, mind you, in that same state.
Yeah. Hold on. Let's that's worth emphasizing. This guy who's in Congress right now, who has voted to impeach Donald Trump, he wanted in 2000, he wanted to not count the electoral votes from Florida because he argued at that time they were not properly certified. There was fraud going on in Florida. So let's just not count, which of course would have given it would have meant that Al Gore would have won.
And then he did it again in 2004 when George W. Bush ran for re-election. But instead of Florida, this time it was Ohio.
Yeah.
So this is a guy who has and now you talk about crony politicians scratching crony politicians' backs and them taking care of each other. He is now the senior Democratic whip in the House of Representatives, leading the charge, pushing Democrats to get behind both impeachment attempts of President Trump.
And so some of our listeners right now might be thinking, well, that was different because he was a judge. He was a federal judge, and so maybe that just means he couldn't be a judge again. But I want to share here another passage from the Constitution, which I have in front of me. This is there's more language about impeachment in Article 2, which is the article that describes the presidency. At the very end of Article 2, it says, quote, "The president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors." So if someone raises the question, well, who can be impeached, convicted, and removed from office? The president can, the vice president can, and all civil officers. That includes every judge, every member of Congress, anybody who's part of the federal government, and that includes a federal judge like Alcee Hastings, who's now a member of Congress.
There's all kinds of questions about this impeachment trial in particular.
Yeah.
You could make a whole lot of arguments about what their goal is, what their political goal is, because it's a political case. Donald Trump is now a private citizen, and they're even debating whether or not it should be allowed. I mean, and that's a political argument as well, right?
Yep.
The Republicans in Congress right now or in the Senate today are arguing that you shouldn't be able to impeach a private citizen or a past political office holder.
Let's also be clear about the politics here. And I'm just speaking politically. If you're a Democrat, you have good reasons to be really scared of Donald Trump. He beat you in 2016, and he beat a very well-established, well-known, right? I mean, he beat Hillary Clinton. And in 2020, he received, Donald Trump, whatever you think about him, here's a piece of data that is mighty important. He received more votes than any prior presidential candidate ever in American history. Right. That is quite something. Only one person has ever earned more, and that was Joe Biden in the same election.
It makes me think of Vegas. It's the bad beat rule, right? I don't know if you've ever seen this in a poker room in Vegas. Most poker rooms, and they have this at even smaller casinos around the country. there's a running total on a wall, and it's a number that keeps going up over time.
Okay.
And every time there's what they call a bad beat, it resets. And what a bad beat is, it's a consolation prize if you have a monster hand, a great poker hand, and you still end up losing, right? If you have a straight flush and you lose to a royal flush, if you have 4 of a kind and you lose to a straight flush, the casino doesn't want you to get angry and quit and walk away. They want you to keep gambling.
Right.
So they actually have a prize. It's a consolation prize for the bad beat. Trump had a bad beat. I mean, regardless of he had the greatest number of votes ever, except for one other person who happened to be in the same election.
Right.
That doesn't even get into the question of whether or not they were legitimate and everything else. And we're not going to go back down that road again.
Just in terms of the numbers we have access to.
He is a political threat.
So what are they doing with that significant political threat posed by Donald Trump? They have reached for a tool, impeachment, and the notion what they're impeaching him for is inciting insurrection. Now, I like to point out, if Democrats genuinely believe, really thoroughly, sincerely believe that he incited insurrection, that is a crime. That is a part of the federal code, criminalizes both insurrection and inciting insurrection in the same section of the code, and it's a serious crime. Then they should also be pushing to have him charged with that crime. I suspect, my guess is, I don't make many predictions because I'm almost always wrong about everything, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and make a prediction that there will be no criminal charge brought against Trump for insurrection, even though inciting insurrection is a federal crime, because I think that Democrats know, and all their their crony connections within the Justice Department and everywhere else, they know that they won't get a conviction, that the evidence just isn't there for a jury of ordinary citizens is not going to convict him. And then that would look really bad. If they brought these articles of impeachment for an allegation that he's also tried for in a criminal court, and he's not convicted in the criminal court, then it makes the impeachment process look really shallow, really partisan.
So let's clarify what you were just saying, just to really simplify that, because it's a little bit complex for a lot of people. The potential conviction in the Senate is a political conviction of impeachment. Then you're talking about a separate trial in a court of law.
A criminal
court of law.
Yes.
As a citizen of the United States, not as a political servant, but as a citizen of the United States, for somebody who incited insurrection against the government, and therefore we're going to charge you with a criminal penalty.
Think of it in terms of if you're a member of a club, if you're a member of the Vino Veritas Society or some other club, a church, any kind of organization, and you're accused of doing something really nefarious and ugly. The question of whether the organization asks you to leave, that's separate from being charged with an actual crime, right? An organization can say, look, we think you did this bad thing, and we really don't want you in our organization, our church, whatever it is. Would you please go? That's different than being convicted of a crime in a criminal court where you can be put in jail. And so that's the difference between impeachment and the criminal, the criminal process. If a politician violates the criminal code, they can and should be charged with a crime. And if they are convicted by a jury, possibly go to prison. That's entirely separate from impeachment.
There was a great example locally here. And, I've been involved in the Denver Republican Party for a number of years. And we had our organizational meeting this weekend where they elected a new executive team, a new chairman and vice chairs and secretary. And one of the vice chairs who was elected, within 24 hours of his election, some former Facebook posts surfaced where he made some extremely anti-Semitic comments. He was removed within minutes. The new chairman approached him, said, I didn't know about this. This is not how our board is going to be represented. I'm going to ask you to please resign. And he did.
And that's separate.
And that's separate
from whether or not he committed a crime.
What he said wasn't a crime.
Right.
Do I like it? Absolutely not.
Right.
You know, we know my background. I don't appreciate that. It's not some guy I'm going to go socialize with. But
it's the ugly side of free speech.
Yeah, he didn't commit a crime, and he'll never be charged with a crime.
Right.
And that's the real question here too.
Yeah.
So I think the bigger next step is really defining. You know, there was a question of should Trump be charged with sedition.
Yep.
There was a question of should he be charged with insurrection. They settled on incitement of insurrection.
Mm-hmm.
I think defining those terms, and then there's really a conversation. You know, we spent the last 2+ months on this podcast talking about what we believe are the fundamental precepts of the Declaration of Independence, the basis of this country, and the virtues that go along with that. 3 in particular. We have the precept of the right of revolution, and we have 2 precepts. I'm going to actually say 2 virtues, but I'm going to actually say 3. One, our third virtue, is civic knowledge, understanding what sedition, insurrection are. Where is that line? As well as being able to then apply your self-assertion and your self-restraint to be able to balance that and know where the line is.
Well, remember, when we were going through the virtues, I made the argument, and I'm going to repeat it here. We say there are 4, but the truth is all of them are contained within each other.
Right.
If you start drilling into one, you bump into the others. I mean, I would argue self-reliance is actually a part of this too, because to be self-reliant means you have to be largely independent and free. And you can't be independent and free if your government, right, is taking your stuff and tyrannizing over you. And so even being self-reliant is going to involve some self-assertion, right, and some civic knowledge. So it's going to tie all those virtues in. Why don't we talk about these terms of there's sedition, there's insurrection, and we really should include a third. They're all closely related. Treason.
Right. Absolutely.
Lawyers and certainly in the legal code, there are these subtle little nuanced differences between them. They're all very much related to each other. And maybe we'll start at the top with treason and work our way down. Treason is interesting because it's the only crime defined in the United States Constitution. I'm really enjoying this podcast, Dave, because it's given me lots of excuses to read from the Constitution, which is one of my favorite things to do. This is so I've opened up the Constitution to Article 3,
right,
which is the very short article that creates the judicial branch of the federal government. And it concludes with this statement about treason. So this is Section 3 of Article 3 of the United States Constitution. Treason against the United States shall consist only. So that's an interesting word, only, meaning no law. Congress cannot change the definition of treason. What is treason? It's only this thing. Treason shall consist only in levying war against the United States, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. So treason in general is connected to actual acts of war, and usually enemies in war. Typically, we think of treason as, if we're think of World War II, we are at war with Germany, with Italy, with Japan. If you are assisting them, you're helping them. You're giving them plans. Our plan. You're telling them when our Navy ships are leaving ports, and you're picking up the phone and you're calling the Japanese government, and you're assisting them. That's treason. In a time of war, actually helping one of our enemies. And for treason, it says, it also makes clear, this is in the Constitution, no person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. It goes on and says, the Congress shall have power to declare the punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of the person attained. So the punishment, right, can be declared by Congress. This is one of these little noticed but beautiful features of the United States Constitution, is that phrase that says, no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood. What that means is, this is a practice that went back through the medieval ages back into the ancient world, where if a person was convicted of some serious crime against the regime, not only were they punished, typically executed or something awful.
Head on a pike on the front gate.
Something really ugly.
Yeah.
So were their families.
Right.
And some members of the families would actually be punished or imprisoned. Others would be disqualified from, certain civil rights and things like that. And what this is saying is if you engage in treason and you're convicted, only you get punished. Your kids can't be punished. Your spouse can't be punished. Your parents can't be. They can't come after the rest of your family. You're the one who did this thing.
And let's be clear, that's very unique to the United States and the United States Constitution. The practice you were just talking about isn't just an old world practice. That is still very much alive in many other countries around the world.
Yeah.
A huge portion of our refugee programs in the United States are political refugees who have come here because a father was arrested by a government accused of treason, and the family had to flee because the entire family would be killed.
Well, it's a great point that you make. I had a little personal connection with this. The former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, a man named Tamrat Lane, Layne. People can look him up. From I think it was 1991 to 94, he was the Prime Minister of Ethiopia until one of his right-hand guys turned on him and started to see him as competition and wanted to get rid of him, accused him of political crimes against the government. He was convicted, and he spent the next 12 years in an Ethiopian prison. And here's my role in this. I interviewed this guy. I sat down for probably a total of, 150 hours at my kitchen table and talked to him about his life story. His wife and his children and some others, some distant relatives, they all fled. They left. They went to Kenya, and in Kenya they went to the U.S. Embassy seeking asylum, and the reason was that government in Ethiopia, they were coming after them.
Yep.
You don't want to be related, even if you did nothing wrong. Yep. Just the mere fact that your relative is in the bad graces of the government, right? I mean, can you imagine living in North Korea today or living in Iran today? And if someone in your family, if the government comes after them, they're coming after you too. It's one of the things that gives these totalitarian regimes such awesome, terrible power. Is they don't just go after individuals, they go after everyone connected to them.
Because they operate on fear.
Yes.
The entire goal is to make you so afraid that not only, some people, they have freedom fighter in their blood and they're willing to sacrifice their own life to go fight for freedom, but they're not willing to go sacrifice their wife and children, their family. And we've seen that in all kinds of ways. We saw that under Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We've seen that in Russia in the USSR first, but continues in Russia, right?
And this is going to lead to these other terms, right? So we were talking about treason, and that's going to lead to insurrection and sedition. Why these totalitarian regimes, they have detailed laws and regulations against sedition and insurrection. And again, think of a place like North Korea. Oh, you don't even want to be accused of sedition because bad things are going to happen to you and to your family and everyone that you know and love. And so the best thing is just to shut up.
Yep.
It's just to say nothing. And it's why, I don't know if anybody's ever written about this, but there's a fascinating story to be told. In totalitarian regimes are quiet. They're quiet places. Think of a free city. Think of the bustling, lots of people and talk and action and things happening. You don't find that in totalitarian regimes. Everyone is stone silent because they're worried if they say anything, it might be misinterpreted or misunderstood, and they might get charged with some terrible crime. And so it's best to just shut up. And that leads us from treason, which is sort of an act of war, aiding a foreign enemy in an act of war. Then there's insurrection. Insurrection is an actual physical violent attack against your own government. So you're not align with a foreign enemy, you and maybe a few friends of yours, you're actually going after your own government. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I'll just throw this out as a historical example. When Southerners in South Carolina bombarded Fort Sumter, which is it's a tiny little island. It's a military ammunitions depot there. And it's right in the Charleston Harbor, it's this circular harbor, and there's that little island sitting right there. You can see it from there. Someday we're going to take a cool trip and do a tour of Fort Sumter, where the Civil War began. When they bombarded Fort Sumter, Lincoln viewed that as insurrection. That's insurrection because that is part of the federal government, as property owned by the federal government. And this is a violent attack. They were shooting cannons at it and blew the whole thing up. Miraculously, nobody actually died, which is sort of amazing because it was something like 36 hours of constant, uninterrupted bombardment with cannon fire. That's insurrection. And then inciting insurrection means you're not actually shooting, you're not actually violently attacking, but you're encouraging others to attack the government. That's what Donald Trump has been charged with. His statements on January 6th, coupled with other things that he said in the past, this is what his accusers are saying. This all adds up to inciting actual insurrection, violent insurrection against the government. And then you have sedition. Sedition, basically, the way I like to think about it, sedition is the speech that precedes insurrection or treason, either. There's probably going to be some planning. So the way lawyers will parse this out, if you and I sit and say, boy, we're really unhappy with what the government's doing right now. I hate that stimulus package they're going to pass. It's unconstitutional, just like Obamacare was and just like Dodd-Frank was. And you agree with me, and we're venting our frustration at all the unwise, unconstitutional things our government's doing. Lawyers would say that's not sedition because you're not actually planning, plotting, organizing an attack against the government. Now, if we were having conversations where we're using speech and we're saying, make sure these certain weapons show up at this place and this time because we're going to use them to attack the government, that's sedition. You're now engaged in, seditious talk.
What's interesting about what you just said, and we've talked about this offline, United States citizens, private citizens, don't have the protection of sedition.
Right.
You can't commit sedition against a private citizen of the United States.
Or business.
What we saw this summer in many American cities all over the country was organizers dropping off cement bricks, rocks, stones, spray paint, other items to do damage to local businesses and to local cities, some of which did get used on state capitol buildings, on state courthouses,
even some
federal courthouses,
federal buildings.
And there was a coordinated effort to organize and put things in place to allow people to go incite violence.
Which means they were engaged in sedition. And let's be clear here, sedition and inciting insurrection. I suppose there are probably some lawyers out there somewhere who would parse out a difference, but they sure seem to be basically the same thing, right? It's speech or communication leading to actual insurrection. So sedition and inciting insurrection seem to be the same thing. And you're right. Only governments are protected by laws against sedition and insurrection. The rest of citizens, what we have laws against libel and slander. So if someone communicates, if they're speaking or if they're writing materials and they're writing falsehoods to try to cause damage to you, to hurt your business, to hurt your reputation, there are laws on the books. We can sue in a civil court if someone has libeled us or slandered us, but that's it.
And you just said it. It's in a civil court, meaning it's a tort law. It's a financial penalty. If somebody slanders you, if somebody libels you, they're not going to prison.
Right.
They're not being prevented from doing a job in the future. They're not being prevented.
Right.
It's a financial crime.
Right.
It's a financial penalty, rather.
And so as we pull on this thread here, going from treason to insurrection to sedition, we run into some really deep and interesting and challenging questions, possible conflicts. Clearly, right, the idea of free speech on the one hand, free speech, say whatever you want, total freedom of speech, and the idea of sedition. It is criminal to speak in certain ways about the government. Mm-hmm. These two things, there's some, to use a term that people in the realm of political philosophy love to use, there's some tension between these
quite a bit
between these two ideas. And it raises a question, do all governments or do some governments, depending on their character, do they have the rightful authority, I mean the morally rightful authority, to pass sedition laws, to pass laws against insurrection? And I think many people, their sort of their first response is, well, yeah, of course. You can't have people planning to overturn the government. And yet I want to remind our listeners, we were born out of revolution.
Right.
This country was born in revolution. All these laws that we have against sedition and insurrection, the British government had those same laws.
Yep.
In 1775, 1776. And we Americans, we violated them. We have to be really, really clear about this. Those revolutionaries of 1776, starting with the greatest of them all, George Washington, and everybody who was fighting along with Washington, and everyone who was giving aid and comfort to Washington's army, mm-hmm. they were lawbreakers.
Yep.
They were breaking a whole bunch of, not just breaking laws, they were breaking serious laws. These were criminal offenses, typically punishable by execution.
Sure.
You were either getting hanged or you're getting shot.
And what's interesting is many former British colonies still have serious sedition laws without much control and insurrection laws on the books. You know, the sedition insurrection laws in the United States have kind of come and gone back and forth over the years. We had them early on under Adams in 1798. Mm-hmm. Went away, came back under Lincoln, under Grant for a little bit regarding the Civil War. Then we had them come back again in 1918 under Woodrow Wilson, and then again in the mid 20th century. And we've kind of had this back and forth. A country like India, which we consider today to be fairly free, mm-hmm. just last week had a major criminal trial for a radio host who was being charged with sedition. Yeah. A radio host who was saying the Indian government is not treating its citizens properly, and we need to do something about it. And there was a major trial surrounding that case. So
let's go back to the original Sedition Acts. They were in 1798. The Federalists, of course, they controlled the White House. They had John Adams, and they controlled Congress. And there's some background to this, and it includes some foreign policy interests. The Federalists tended to look more favorably upon the British, even though we had just fought a big war against them. They were still, and this includes even people like Alexander Hamilton, who I don't question Hamilton's freedom credentials, but he did have a certain respect for the English Constitution, the English way of governing that had developed over the course of many centuries. He respected the good parts of that. And the opponents, the Jeffersonians, they were just starting to form the inklings of what would become the really first political party. And it makes it so confusing because it was called the Democratic Republican Party. And then people don't know if that's, is that the modern Democratic Party or Republican Party. But the point is, Jefferson and his partisan friends tended to view France more favorably. And this becomes important because they were fighting each other. The British and the French they've been fighting each other for centuries.
The quasi-war, as it was referred.
Yes. And so these Federalists, including John Adams as president, they pass these measures because they worry about the French influence. They're worried about French citizens on American soil, maybe trying to undermine the American government, change the culture, change popular opinion in ways that are pro-French, which means pro-radical, which means pro-guillotine, right, and pro-Jacobin. And so they passed these measures, the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Sedition Act made it a crime to write false and malicious and scandalous things about the government. Now, defenders a guy I used to teach with at Hillsdale College. He liked to defend the Sedition Acts.
Okay.
And he would defend them on this ground. It did say that the statement had to be false, which meant truth was a defense. If you were accused of sedition and you could say, well, the thing I wrote, yes, it was very critical, it's also true.
Right.
Here's the evidence. And so he would love to defend that as this great beacon of free speech, that the idea of truth, being a defense of speech, it is an important milestone in the history of free speech legislation. The challenge is that was so easily manipulated and blurred, right? Things that are malicious, things that are scandalous against the government. And that's exactly the way it was practiced immediately. The only people who were arrested for sedition in that period were a bunch of partisan opponents to the Federalists. And they tended to be like newspaper editors, right? People who were using speech to, influence opinion and these things.
Which is, as we've talked about in the past, that was a big time of yellow journalism.
Absolutely.
Where the media itself were openly biased, right? We are a newspaper supporting the Federalists, or we are a newspaper supporting the Democratic Republicans. We are not pretending to be unbiased journalists. We are here to advocate on behalf of a certain policy or party.
Yeah, I've mentioned before, I actually kind of preferred that journalism. Yeah. There was no pretense of objectivity, right? At least you knew there was some honesty there. You knew what you were actually going to get. It's also, this is one of these strange tangents, but it's so relevant to our world today, how the Sedition Act ties in to the whole ugly history of race and slavery. One of the Democratic Republican newspaper editors was a rather famous one at the time named James Callender. He was charged and arrested, and I believe he spent some time in prison. He campaigned in his own writing letters and articles from a prison cell for Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson gets elected. I don't remember if Callender was pardoned or if he just served out his sentence. Either way, he became a free man again. And he expected a crony appointment from Jefferson because he thought, hey, man, I was rooting for you even from a prison cell, right? Pay me back. Make me postmaster or something, right? Something. Jefferson didn't.
Right.
And that leads to an act of revenge that in many ways has altered the course of history, because it's James Callender who first publishes accusations that Thomas Jefferson had fathered children with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. That whole Sally Hemings controversy, right, which puts this cloud of suspicion over the author of the Declaration of Independence, begins with James Callender. And James Callender was angry because he didn't get an appointment. And he was angry because he served time in prison. And the reason he served time in prison, he violated the sedition. Well, he was accused and convicted of violating the Sedition Act of 1798. Sort of amazing how these things are all tied together.
Well, it just shows that most of this stuff has always been political. Before we run out of time, and it's probably worth us picking back up on this next week, especially as more of the Senate hearings have played out and we have a better idea of where things are coming out. But I want to tie two things you said a few minutes ago all back together, because I think there's one big question here that we haven't answered. And that is, you posed the question, is sedition a problem? Is insurrection a problem? Is treason a problem if the government itself is acting immorally?
Yeah.
And that was a question for the British, right? Yeah. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington and the rest of the founders acted in a way that was considered treason and insurrection by the British Crown.
Let's be real clear. The Declaration of Independence was sedition.
Right.
That was seditious speech. And George Washington shooting at British soldiers, that is insurrection.
Right.
Yes.
And all of it combined was considered treason.
Yes.
And then you asked, you said, so is it okay if they're acting immorally? And a lot of people's response would be, well, how do you define what's moral and immoral?
Yeah.
And this goes back to our precepts. We believe that there is a moral objective truth.
Yeah.
There are moral objective truths that all men are created equal, and among those are the individual equal natural rights of all human beings. Mm-hmm. That's how you do it. So now you talk about
and take the next step. That also means it is morally right and proper and fitting for a government to protect the individual rights of citizens.
Right.
And it is objectively morally wrong for a government to violate the rights of its citizens. And so that raises a really big question. I'll put it this way. This kind of has an edge on it. Given what our government is today, and I'm not talking about the ideas of the founding.
Right.
I'm not talking about the sort of the regime in speech created by the Constitution. I mean the actual government we have today, the gigantic, bloated administrative state. Is it morally right for citizens today to engage in sedition?
You know who I'd like to answer that question?
Who?
Your former colleague at Hillsdale, who did say he supports sedition, but a sedition law, but he said in the exception if something is true.
Right.
Right? So if we agree that there is a moral objective truth, then would he say that somebody is acting seditiously or acting as insurrection because they were acting under truth?
I knew him quite well, and I'm gonna venture to speak for him a little bit. We used to share offices, and our offices were right next to each other, and we spent a lot of time talking about these things. And I pressed him on this. I think he would make the argument that a truthful critique of government is not seditious. Sedition is a false, and not just a false, a maliciously false, meaning some conjured untrue story, and it's conjured precisely to do damage to the government, to undermine the credibility of the government. That's sedition, he would argue. If it's a true criticism, if government is spending way more money than they should be spending, they're spending us into terrible debt, and we say, you guys are spending more money than you should, and you're spending us into terrible debt. He would say that's not sedition. You're truthfully pointing out what they're actually doing, and so that raises what happens as a government goes from being good, mostly good, on balance good. It does its proper job. It's trying to protect the rights of citizens, and it's transforming into something not good.
Right.
It's transforming into some kind of central planning tyranny, and we're somewhere in the middle. We're not in a regime of freedom today. We're not in a totally centrally planned tyranny. We're somewhere in the middle. Should citizens be talking, thinking, planning, organizing to transform, even overthrow that regime that we're in, or make some big fundamental change? Remember Barack Obama said his purpose, his entire campaign was to fundamentally transform the United States.
Right.
Is that sedition?
That's a good question.
Taking a regime and saying, I want to change what the thing is.
Well, and is it sedition and insurrection if people are trying to stand up and prevent that?
Right.
And I would pose the question, and I would posit that Joe Biden, there's no secret. This is an extension. This is a third term of the Obama policy. Right? This is an extension. This is the things that didn't get done under Obama that now Joe Biden wants to continue and take to that next level.
Right.
Could Trump make a legitimate claim if he was defending himself in the Senate or if he was defending himself in a court of law? Let's say they did bring this to trial, which we both agree is never going to happen. But if Donald Trump was defending himself and said, I was doing this to prevent an illegitimate government, I was doing this to prevent a removal of constitutional law, everything I did was in the interest of the United States, could make a legitimate argument about that. I was standing up for moral objective truth, and that was my job as president. That's not insurrection or sedition.
Right.
That was my job, not only as the president, but also as a citizen.
In fact, my old friend John Eastman, who was part of that, he was right in the middle of that. That's the argument that he has made, that what Trump was trying to do was preserve the integrity of state-based electoral processes, which there were many allegations, legitimate allegations, that there were serious problems, including from state legislators. State legislators in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, several other states, actually petitioned Mike Pence and said, we in these states, we have reason to think there are problems in the way these votes are counted. Give us more time to go back and verify these vote counts, because we're not confident that they were actually. And then it gets so muddy because most of those state legislatures were not in session at the time, and so they were petitioning their governments or their governor, saying, "You, the governor, you have the power to call us into session. Call us into session." And then it raises a whole separate question. Well, you're the state legislature. That's your job to make sure that The electoral votes are assigned the way you want them to be assigned.
Right.
The Constitution gives you that direct power. Maybe you should just assemble yourselves, right, and not wait for a governor to call you into session. That's one instance of this bigger question. And I think, where we're leading here, this is dangerous stuff. I don't want to make light of this because this is the kind of stuff that starts wars and sends people to prison, and this is life or death political stuff. If anybody who records this and uses this for nefarious purposes, I want to make sure that this part of my statement is included. If you agree with the principles and arguments of the American Revolution, then there are moments, there are circumstances and situations that demand sedition and insurrection. That's how the revolutionaries viewed it. They said moral right, justice, requires us to engage in sedition and insurrection. They were violating the sedition laws and the insurrection laws, the treason laws, right, against the British Empire. And they made an argument that they were morally justified to do so, that they were in the moral right because the regime had become unjust. Engaging in sedition, trying to overthrow an unjust regime is a morally right thing to do. According to the Declaration of Independence, remember, we not only have a right to revolution, we have a duty. We have a moral obligation to not let unjust crony, people in government violate our rights. Stand up to them, and there are the virtues of self-restraint and self-assertion. Stand up for your rights, for your liberty, for your property, and protect it from all enemies, including those in government. And that's kind of a shocking thing, I think, for modern Americans today to hear, because my hunch is, this is just a guess, my hunch is the vast majority of our fellow citizens probably think, oh, sedition is always wrong. Insurrection is always wrong. Well, that wasn't the argument of the founders. We wouldn't have a United States today if they believed insurrection and sedition were always wrong.
And a lot of that is based solely on one's understanding of where rights come from.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that is why we have the Vino Veritas Society. It's to remind people and to guard those ideas that we are born with rights. Rights are truths. They exist, whether we acknowledge them or not, whether the government acknowledges them or not. We have certain unalienable natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
And that means we have a standard by which to judge our government.
Right.
And so one of the messages we should be communicating is, you in government, if you don't want citizens engaged in sedition and insurrection, then be just.
Right.
Do what is right. Protect the rights of citizens. Stop scheming and looking for excuses to violate the rights of citizens, to control their property, to confiscate their money, to run their lives. That's not why you're in office.
And as long as you are, we will continue to be the guardians.
That's right. No sumos custodes.
I'll keep on this next week.